Well, good morning, Meadowbrook. How are we doing this morning? It's good, hearty good morning. I like it. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We are so glad that you are with us as well. So we're going to be in Luke chapter 10 this morning. So if you have a Bible with you, I invite you to go ahead and open up to Luke 10. We'll be starting in verse 25 in a few minutes. So when our kids were younger, and when we just had two kids, when they were like 3 years old and 1 year old, we had this daily routine that kind of started the end of our day. And that started with me getting home from work, taking our two kids, putting them in a stroller, getting our dog on a leash, and taking them for a walk. It was primarily out of necessity for my wife, because she was like, hey, I've been with these kids all day. This dog's driving me crazy. Can you take them for a little walk just to give me some space to collect my thoughts and regain some of my sanity? And so every day I get home, and she's like sometimes even just waiting like outside in the front yard with him already in the stroller, the dog already on the leash, and she's like, here you go, welcome home. So I gladly did that every day, and on one day, I'm walking the kids, and I'm trying to catch up from emails from the day. I've got my phone, and I'm kind of like thumbing through things, trying to respond to some text messages and some emails. And as I'm doing that, kind of holding all of this in my hand, I hear up ahead of me on the street that my neighbor is pulling his trash can from his house to the curb. The next day was trash day, and so he's just naturally getting ready for the trash truck to come and collect his trash. And as I hear like the scraping sound of the trash can, I look up and I do this quick calculation. And I realize if I keep walking at this speed and he keeps walking down his driveway at that speed, we are going to meet at the exact same time on the curb. And then I might have to engage with my neighbor. Like I might have to say hi to him. I might have to talk to him. I might have to ask him a question. And I've got all these important emails that I'm responding to, and I don't know if I could be bothered by that. So what I did is what I'm assuming some of us have done somewhere along the way. I buried my head in my phone, and I let my dog pull me to the other side of the street. I made it look like she was going that way to look at something, and I was just being a good dog owner following her, and I totally avoided my neighbor. Anybody ever do that before? Yeah. First service was like, aw, you did that. And I was like, no, don't give me an aw, like you've never done that before. We all do that. We all find places in our life where we're like, oh, there's that person over there. Last time we talked, it was awkward and weird. I think I'm just going to go over here. You walk into a coffee shop and you see, as you're in line, you're like, oh, there's that person I used to work with and we never got along well. So instead of sitting on that side of the coffee shop, I'm going to sit over there. Just this week, I was in Qdoba grabbing lunch and I'm paying, like I go through the assembly line and I'm now paying. And in behind me walks a pastor who I've met before, and he goes to start his order. And there are 0 people in the assembly line between he and I. It would have been real natural for our eyes to connect and just say, hey, man, how's it going? And I was like, I'm too busy. I got stuff to do. I don't know if I really want to talk to him today. And I just paid, and I scooted out before even acknowledging that he was there. If we're honest with ourselves, many of us at times have had moments where we have intentionally avoided other people. One of the things that we are hoping for as a church is that we would grow into a community of kingdom storytellers who have this ability to participate with God, to pay attention to His work in our lives and participate with what He is doing so that we might be able to leverage our story and tell our story to influence our community with the good news of Jesus Christ and what He has done and is doing in our life. Our other hope is that we as a community would begin to see our neighborhoods and the wider Milwaukee area as our mission field. That we would grow to understand that Jesus has sent us to this community. As Jesus says to His disciples the last night He's with them before He goes to the cross, just as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. And that doesn't necessarily mean we will be sent to the other side of the world, but it certainly means at the very least we will be sent. We are sent people who should have a missional mindset right where we are. And so in order to help people think through, like, how do I do that? How do I become that person? We've created this simple pathway of 5 things that you can do on a daily basis in real time to become the type of person who is a kingdom storyteller and sees our world, our community, as a mission field. Those 5 things are: 1, to regularly practice hearing from God, trusting that He is regularly speaking, regularly communicating, regularly revealing, and that we would hear and respond. 2, that we would know, specifically that we would know God's story, and we would know that our story is caught up in His story. 3, that we would practice simply being with Jesus, to commune with Him, to build relationship with Him, knowing that all of His life will flow into and through us the more time we just spend with Him. And then 4, today we're leaning into this idea of love, specifically what it means to love God, because one of the hallmark characteristics of a follower of Jesus Christ is that we are called to be people who primarily, first and foremost, above anything else, love God. We read that in Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6:4 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." Love the Lord completely. And as we'll see this morning, one of the ways that we can practice loving God is by loving other people, loving those in our life, loving those in the community, because all of us, including these other people, are created in the image of God, and one of the ways we honor God is by honoring, respecting, and loving the image of God in other people. And newsflash, you can't you can't love people if you're working to avoid them. Like, it just doesn't work that way. And so one of the things that we're hoping, in addition to becoming a kingdom storyteller, is that we would be a community of people who are kingdom neighbors. That we would see we all have influence in our lives. We all have the ability to have influence specifically in the places we live. I'm curious, does anybody here live in a neighborhood? Anybody here live in a neighborhood? Yeah, like everybody lives in a neighborhood. Like, anybody have neighbors who live around them? Yeah, guess what? You have neighbors who live around you. Really easy way to practice loving God is through practicing loving your actual neighbors. And we're going to look at a story this morning that Jesus tells that casts vision for what it looks like to be a kingdom neighbor. And this story that Jesus tells actually is preceded by a conversation that Jesus is having with an individual who is said to be an expert in the law. This is what we read. This is Luke 10, starting in verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" So the person interacting with Jesus is said to be an expert in the law, which could make him a priest. It could make him a rabbi. It's probably somebody who has spent his life studying the Old Testament, maybe even has the majority of the Old Testament memorized. You might say it's an equivalent of somebody who could be like a seminary professor today, who has dedicated their whole life to studying and learning and studying and learning. This guy probably knows more of the Old Testament scriptures in 1/4 inch of his brain than the most of the people in Israel have in their entire brain. Now, at this point in Jesus' ministry, he has had lots of interactions with people who are trying to test and challenge him, but this one seems to be a little bit different. Because at this point in his ministry, most of the time when Jesus is having a conversation with Pharisees and teachers of the law, they're challenging, they're being a little aggressive, they're furious with Jesus, and we learn that they are looking for a way to trap him, ultimately to execute him. But this guy seems to be more on the respectful side of things. To start, he calls Jesus teacher, a little bit of a sign of respect. And Jesus was thought to be a rogue teacher, a teacher who has no credentials, who has nobody backing him, saying like, hey, I've trained him, I'm putting my stamp of approval on his teaching. Jesus is just out teaching the things that he knows to be true from the Lord himself without any credentials. But Jesus is also a master teacher. And what he does in this moment as a master teacher is he responds to this guy's question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? With another question. Verse 26. "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" To which this guy then replies, verse 27, he answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." So this guy answers Jesus with the simple, love God and love your neighbor. Now, in Matthew 22, Jesus is in a very similar exchange with a group of Pharisees. And these Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask Jesus, what is the most important commandment in all of the Old Testament? There's over 600 commands in the Old Testament. Pick the most important one. And Jesus names this very commandment, coming from Deuteronomy 6, which we just read. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's said to be the most important, the most significant, the most weighty commandment in all of the scriptures. And then Jesus adds to that in Matthew 22, and love your neighbor as yourself, which is a quote from Leviticus 19. So at the very least, this expert of the law is parroting back to Jesus what he knows to be Jesus' answer. But at the same time, this could be the answer for all of Israel, meaning all Israelites knew that loving God, Deuteronomy 6, was the most important command. It could be that they also thought loving your neighbor was equally important, or Jesus added that, and this guy is just parroting back to Jesus, giving him the answer that he knows Jesus wants. And Jesus says in Matthew 22, the entire Old Testament is summed up. All 613 commands are simply summed up by these two. Love God with all of who you are, and love your neighbor as yourself. But we read in verse 29, this guy had a little motivation behind his question to begin with, and this is what we read. But he, the expert of the law, wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And what we learn about this individual in this moment is that at some level, he might be looking for a cop-out. Meaning he might be looking for a way to justify limiting his love to only those he desires to love. And when you look at Leviticus 19, and this whole idea of who's my neighbor, it kind of comes clear, like what he's trying to do. Because Leviticus 19 is a long chapter in Leviticus. It's pretty much a list of laws. Certain sections of it kind of feel like part of the 10 Commandments. It says, "Be holy, for I am holy. Do not have any idols, or do not worship any false gods. Keep the Sabbath. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't do all these other things." But then you hit verse 13 through 18 in Leviticus 19, and the term neighbor is used 5 times. And this is the part of the scriptures where Jesus is pulling from when he says, love God and love your neighbor. These are the 2 most important commands. The whole Old Testament hangs on these 2 things. He's pulling from this section where 5 times in verse 13 through 18, it uses the term neighbor, how you love your neighbor, how you treat your neighbor. But there's also this distinction being made in Leviticus 19 between those who are Israelites and those who are foreigners. Because there's a couple laws that specifically name how you treat a foreigner. And so what this guy is concluding is like, well, neighbor must mean Israelite, not foreigner. So therefore, if I'm called to love my neighbor is an Israelite, not a foreigner. Perhaps I don't have to love those who are different than me. And in the first century, there would have been a fair amount of foreigners living in Israel, namely Romans, who were there on behalf of the Roman Empire, keeping the peace for the emperor in Rome, and they were not always nice or agreeable to the Israelites. And so it could be that this expert of the law is looking to define, these are the people that I have to love. Those who are like me, those who agree with me, those who view the world as I do, and these other people, these foreigners, they're not really my neighbor, they're a foreigner. Maybe I have to treat them with respect, but I don't actually have go the extra mile to love them. Right, Jesus? Now, Jesus, being a master teacher, now answers this guy's question, not with another question this time, but by simply telling a story. And this is the story that he tells. Verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And when he was attacked by robbers. And they stripped him of his clothes, they beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a downhill road because Jerusalem was always up. Everything else was down. It was an 18-mile road. Kind of had the terrain of a desert. It was rocky. It was sandy. It was dirty. And Jericho was thought to be a little bit of an oasis in comparison to this 18-mile road. And it was thought that some of the ruling class would often travel this road. Herod had a winter palace in Jericho. Jericho was also thought to be a little bit of an oasis because the topography and the terrain contrasted the desert road of this 18-mile stretch and was a little bit more lush and green. And so you'd get ruling class people who would travel to Jericho to have a little oasis retreat. And so it wasn't uncommon for bandits and robbers to hide out on this dangerous road to mug and rob people as they were traveling, who might have lots of money and means. So Jesus is simply telling a story that people would identify with and be like, yeah, I've heard of that road, and sometimes I've even heard of people getting mugged on that road. But then he adds a couple characters who come upon this man who has just been mugged, two who would necessarily be neighbors of this man. Verse 31, a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed on the other side. Now, Jesus is doing three things with this story to create impact for his listeners. The first thing he's doing is he's setting a simple pattern in place that each character follows through on. That simple pattern is just simply they approach this man who's been left for dead, they see him, and then they respond. The central component of this pattern being the most significant, the seeing of this man. It says with each character, they saw him, and then they respond. They saw him, and then they respond. Because what Jesus is trying to highlight is that with seeing comes responsibility. Paul Miller, in his book, Love Walked Among Us, talks about the responsibility that comes with seeing somebody else in need. He says, love begins with looking. We instinctively know that love leads to commitment, so we look away when we see someone in need because we know we might have to pay, we might have to commit if we look too closely or we care too deeply. Love starts with looking. When we see somebody who's visibly in need, we have some responsibility to help them. I don't know if you've ever seen this show on ABC called What Would You Do? Anybody seen this show? Hosted by John Quinones. It's a simple social experiment show where they set up these scenarios with actors who play out some sort of scene that's kind of uncomfortable, awkward, something's not quite right, and then they film the bystanders and the onlookers to see how they will respond. Maybe it's a child being mistreated in a restaurant, and the parent, again, these are actors, leaves, and the child's left alone, and they want to see how do the people also in the restaurant come around and support this child or help this child or stay at a distance and not get involved. Or they set up a scenario where somebody is blatantly in the middle of the day robbing somebody or stealing a bike from somebody, and there's onlookers seeing this whole thing take place, and then they see and watch and observe, do they help and step in or not? And then there's this awkward moment where they confront the people who are the bystanders and say, hey, why didn't you help in or whatever? And when you watch this show, you naturally think to yourself, if I was there, I would rescue that kid, I would tackle that robber, I would go to great lengths to help if I was there. But the question is, would you really? Like, Jesus is setting up this story to pose that question. Would you really? I have this really vivid memory of being in high school and being in the lunchroom and having an encounter where I saw somebody who was in need. There was this young woman who attended the high school that I attended, and she was a very distinct individual because she would wear black every day. Had black shoes, black tights, a black skirt, a black shirt, a black jacket. She dyed her hair black, and you knew she dyed her hair black because every once in a while it would grow out and her roots would show and they would not be black. And she had black makeup on, black fingernail polish, black, black, black from head to toe. And what made her a little distinct, not only just wearing the black, was she would carry around this bright red Elmo doll that stood in contrast to all of the black that she would wear. So she would be around the schools, didn't have tons of friends, was a little bit of an outsider. And I remember one day at lunch, sitting at the end of a table, all my friends at the table, they're just talking it up, having lunch. She busts into the lunchroom, visibly upset, runs through the lunchroom, and sits down at this table right across from me. I'm on one end of the table. There's a little aisle here, another section of tables, and she's on the other end of that table, and we're facing each other, diagonal from each other, maybe 5 to 7 feet apart. She runs in, she sits down at this table, crying, puts her head in her elbow, and just starts to sob, just starts to wail. And I remember seeing that thinking, like, oh, she is having a really bad day. And then at one point, she picked her head up. And I'll never forget the expression on her face. And it was like she scanned the room, almost to pose the question, does anybody see? Does anybody see that I'm in pain? Does anybody notice that I'm not doing well today? Is there anybody out there who has any shred of compassion and cares that I am in a bad way? And then she put her head down and just started to cry. I remember that so vividly because I had this opportunity to step in and help, but I didn't because I was too afraid of what would come my way. I was too afraid of the associations that would be made between me and her, and it was just easier to turn back to my friends and pretend I didn't see. When we hear stories of people in need, we think to ourselves, I would jump in and I would help out in a heartbeat. But then when you're put in those scenarios, we view them differently. And we come to terms with it's just easier to avoid than engage. And Jesus is telling this story in a way that almost sets up the idea like if I was one of those guys, I would help. And what he does is he tells this story in a way that highlights those who should help, those who we expect to help don't. Those who should help, those who we expect to help, don't. Because there's a priest, a priest who is one of the religious leaders of Jerusalem, probably going to Jerusalem to serve and help in the temple. We would expect a priest to help. And then there's a Levite. A Levite sometimes is a priest. Not all Levites are priests, but most Levites work in the temple in some capacity because the Levites were consecrated, set apart by God to work in the temple. You would expect these two guys to help this man because they are his neighbor. They are fellow Israelites. They are on this journey to go worship God of all things, and they would see somebody in need, and you would anticipate that he would help. Jesus sets up this story in a way where we anticipate that those who should help don't. And then he continues this story with the least likely character being the one who does. He carries on in verse 33. But a Samaritan. And once those listening heard the word Samaritan, their blood would begin to boil. Because the Samaritans were enemies of the Jews. They were foreigners. If there's this distinction between I'm only going to help my neighbor and I'm going to avoid the foreigner, Jesus is putting now the foreigner front and center. And what he says about how the Samaritan engages with this man would be a paradigm buster for his listeners. It says, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And here's where the pattern starts again. And when he saw him, here's his response, he took pity, or he had compassion on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. See, we would anticipate that the priest or the Levite, who is a fellow Israelite of this wounded man, would be the people to help, but it is a foreigner and an enemy who goes the extra mile. And what Jesus does in this moment is he flips the question that's posed by the expert in the law. Because the question that he asks is, who is my neighbor? And Jesus gives a different question here in verse 36. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The initial question posed was, who is my neighbor? But Jesus says, who was the neighbor? And the expert in the law knows. He knows he's been had by Jesus, and he says, it was the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. See, this man was viewing love as an obligation. Like, I'm obligated to love certain people in my life. I'm obligated to love those who are like me, but I'm not necessarily obligated to love those who are different than me, or those who are challenging to love, or those who are awkward in the way they live. I'm not obligated to love them. Maybe it would be nice if I do, but based on the law, love your neighbor, I'm only obligated to love those like me. Right? See, the invitation of this story and of this interaction is to stop calculating our love, but to become the type of person who freely loves, no matter who they come across, no matter who they meet, no matter who is in need. What Jesus is doing is he's casting vision for what it means to be a kingdom neighbor, and kingdom neighbors simply love like Jesus. Because what Jesus says of the Samaritan in this story of all people is the same way that he lived his life. When he sees somebody in need, he has compassion and he engages. You see this repeatedly in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus is walking into a town called Nain. There's a funeral procession coming out of the town. It says that Jesus saw the woman who is going to bury her only son, and his heart went out to her, and he had compassion on her, and he engaged in her scenario, her situation. We saw it last week in Mark 6. Jesus is trying to have a spiritual retreat. He's trying to get away with his disciples to get some rest. They're on a boat crossing from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other. They get to the shore. They hop out of the boat, and there's this massive crowd waiting for them. And we're told that Jesus saw the crowd, and he had compassion on them. Very similar story in Matthew 9. It adds in Matthew 9 that Jesus saw that they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd, and he stepped in to engage. Jesus regularly sees and engages. And that's true for us. Jesus sees us. And Jesus has gone to great lengths to step into our world to redeem us and set us free. Jesus has had incredible compassion on us who have turned our back from God, on God, who have tried to do our own thing. And Jesus could have stepped back and said, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go after them. But like it says in Philippians 2, that Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. But he humbled himself and became obedient and took on the form of a human and walked the road carrying his cross to his death for our sake. Jesus sees and responds with compassion. He sees those who are in need, and he doesn't avoid, but he steps in. Our hope is that as a church, we would be a community of people who become kingdom neighbors, who when we see people in our world, we would resist the temptation to avoid, and we would be willing to step in. And so the question is, how do you actually do that in practice? How do you step into those moments? And I think there are 4 simple things that you can do. The first is you can be curious. You can be curious, specifically about the people who live around you. I would imagine if you live in a neighborhood and you live around people, there's some people in your neighborhood who drive you crazy. And there's some people in your neighborhood you would just rather avoid. But what if you started to get curious about them? What if you started to wonder, why are they the way that they are? We all have stories that have shaped us to be the people we've become. We've had hardships, trauma, highs, lows, victories, successes, downfalls that have shaped us to become the people we've become. And what if we started to wonder, why are they the way that they are? And what is it that I can learn about them to become the type of person who could love them? If you were able to grab a storyteller's journal at the beginning of this series, in the back we put this simple map, this neighborhood map, with instructions right next to it. And you may have wondered, why did they put this in this journal? This is why. Because we are hoping that our community of people not only becomes a kingdom storyteller, but also becomes a kingdom neighbor who can get curious about their neighbors. I have one neighbor who I swear, he's actually avoiding me. Like, he's working really hard to avoid me. We live right next door, and we see each other all the time, but he will barely look at me. And I've started to get to that point where I'm justifying, I don't have to engage with him because he's not engaging with me. But what if I got curious about why? And what if I started to be that annoying neighbor who just kind of sticks my head over the fence and be like, hey, neighbor, how's it going? What do I got to lose? He is already avoiding me. Maybe he's just going to try harder. What if we started to get curious and move towards our neighbors to do the second thing, and that is to practice compassion, to care about what's going on in their life, to practice compassion and actually be curious about who they are and care about what's going on in their life, then to ultimately do the third thing, which is to carry their burdens. So we have be curious, practice compassion, and carry others' burdens. And that doesn't mean you necessarily have to fix their situation, because maybe all they really need is somebody to be present in their situation. I tell people from time to time that half the job of being a pastor is just being present in people's lives. I don't have the power to fix a whole lot of things in people's lives, but I can be present. And you have that same ability as well, to be present, to just be there for them. And then the last thing is to be willing to pay the cost, because there is a cost involved. In the story, we see that there's a cost involved of this man actually paying for the stay at the inn of this beaten man. You may not have to actually pay money, but maybe it costs you your time. Maybe it costs you some of your possessions. Maybe your neighbor wants to borrow your lawnmower and then they run over a tree root and they break it, and then you've got to go spend the money to fix it because they're not willing to. Being a kingdom neighbor at some point will cost you something. There's a guy named Robert Lupton who's in Atlanta. He wrote a book called Theirs is the Kingdom. He was living in a pretty cushy, affluent suburb in Atlanta and started to feel this call from God to move into the inner city to serve those who are in need. And in this book, he tells little stories of the people that he engaged with and what God did to teach him about what it means to be a person of compassion, to be a kingdom neighbor in the midst of being stretched outside your comfort zone. I want to read one story that he wrote. It's not terribly long, but hang with me as I do. I think it casts vision for the simple things that we can do to be a kingdom neighbor and engage with those people we might be tempted to avoid. It says, she is 66 and mildly mentally disabled. She's dangerously overweight, twice a great-grandmother, and a devoted member of our church. She lives with 4 generations of extended family in an overcrowded, dilapidated house, but her buoyant spirit is undaunted. Since losing her youngest son in a senseless murder last Christmas Eve, she has directed much of her affection to me. You're my buddy, she says, with a broad, snaggletooth grin. I pray for you every day. Then she gives me a long bear hug, and she wants to sit right next to me every Sunday at church. And although the smell of stale sweat is often nauseating, she makes me feel a little special. and I'm pleased to have Mrs. Smith by my side. She often hints, sometimes blatantly, that she would like to come home with us for a visit. Nothing would delight her more than to have Sunday dinner with our family. But there's a conflict. It has to do with the values that my wife and I have learned since childhood. We believe that good stewardship means taking care of our belongings, treating them with respect, and getting long service from them. Our boys know that they are not to track in mud on the carpet and sit on the furniture with dirty clothes. To invite Miss Smith into our home means we will have filth and stench soil our couch. There will be a stubborn, offensive odor that lingers in our living room. My greatest fear is that she will want to sit in my new corduroy recliner. I wouldn't want to be rude and cover it with plastic to protect it from the stains she might cause, but I know it would never be the same again. Unknowingly, Miss Smith is forcing a conflict of clashing values upon me. Preserve and maintain, conserve and protect. They are the words of the ethic that have served us well. Over time, these values have subtly filtered into our theology, and it is increasingly difficult to separate the values of capitalism from the values of the kingdom. Why should it be such a struggle to decide which is more godly? To welcome Miss Smith into my home and my corduroy recliner, or to preserve the homey aroma of my sanctuary and get extra years of service from my furniture? Is not this the precise issue of valuing comfort and convenience over serving God? How ingenious of our American version of Christianity to make them both one and the same. We did finally invite Miss Smith to have Sunday dinner in our home, and she did just as I feared she would. She went straight for my corduroy recliner, and it has never been the same since. In fact, Miss Smith has even joined a Bible study in our home. She did it the very next week. And every Wednesday, she comes to our house and heads straight for my chair. She even calls it her chair. I thank God for Miss Smith and the conflict she brings me. In her, more clearly than in a Sunday school lesson or sermon, I encounter the Christ of Scripture saying, "Inasmuch as you have done to the least of these, you have done to me." Jesus is where the needy are. Jesus is near to the brokenhearted. And when we want to love him, the simple way that we can do that is through loving those in need. And so the question for us is, are we going to be the type of people who are kingdom neighbors, who see the need that we have, and how Jesus has moved towards us, and allow that to shape how we view the world and move towards those who are in need, knowing Jesus is with them. And by loving them, we are in turn loving God. And what you get as you engage in this is when you get an incredible story to tell of how you in real time are partnering with God to further his redemptive work in the world. You get to be near Jesus and commune with him in a sweet way. You get to learn and know and understand what his story is all about and how your story is caught up in his. And in the process, I guarantee you, he will be revealing and communicating things to you about who he is and how he's leading you right where you need to be. So may you be willing to see people who are in need, even those who are different than you. May you be willing to move towards them rather than move away from them. And may you be willing to love them, even if it costs you. Lord, we thank you so much for your faithfulness. We thank you so much for your love. We thank you so much that you have moved towards us, that you have paid the cost, that you have shown compassion even to us. May we see, Lord, that it's not because we are deserving, but it's only because of your mercy. May we have eyes to see who you are, what you have done, and what you are doing. May we have courage to follow in your footsteps, to move towards those we'd rather avoid. And may we experience more of you in the process. We love you, Lord. We pray this in your name. Amen.